The room smelled like ambition and leather, the kind of room where men measured each other in seconds and didn't bother hiding it. Brendan Kowalski stood near the back of the elevator as the doors slid open onto the 42nd floor, one hand gripping the strap of a worn canvas bag slung over his shoulder, the other holding a small hand. His daughter's, Emma's, 7 years old and still half asleep, her favorite stuffed rabbit dangling from the crook of her arm. She'd refused to leave it in the car. He hadn't argued. There were battles worth fighting and battles that cost more than they were worth, and at 6:45 in the morning, the rabbit was not one of them. The lobby of Ashford's security group opened wide and cold in front of them. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline in the pale gray light of early morning. 10 men were already there, all standing, none sitting, as if sitting were a weakness they couldn't afford to display. They were big in the way that announced itself, shoulders that filled door frames, necks like columns, arms that didn't hang naturally against their sides. They wore black. They wore it with intention. And then there was Brendan, 39 years old. 6 feet even, which sounds fine until you're standing next to men who treat 6 feet like a consolation prize. A faded gray Henley, dark jeans, work boots he'd had resoled twice. He looked like someone who fixed things for a living, which for the better part of a decade he had. Emma tugged his hand. "Dad, is this a gym?" "No, sweetheart. It looks like a gym, it's a tryout." She looked around at the men, then back up at her father with the flat, unsentimental honesty that only 7-year-olds possess. "For what? A job." She seemed to process this. "Okay," she said, and yawned and leaned against his arm. Nobody in the room said anything, but they all looked. That particular kind of look, the one that starts at the top and travels slowly downward, taking inventory, calculating, arriving at a conclusion before a single word has been exchanged. Brendan had been on the receiving end of that look before. He knew what it meant. He let it pass over him the way rain passes over stone. A man near the window broke first. He was the largest in the room, which in that room was saying something. 6'4", maybe 260, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something geological. His name, Brendan would later learn, was Troy Madden. At that moment, he was just a smirk attached to a body. "You in the right place, man?" Troy said. Not hostile, exactly, just cheerful in the way that isn't. Brendan looked at him steadily. 42nd floor, Ashford Security Group, Bodyguard Candidate Evaluation. "So yeah," Troy's smirk widened. He glanced at the other men, sharing something unspoken. "You bring your kid to a tryout. Babysitter canceled this morning. That's," Troy started and then laughed. Not a mean laugh, but one that carries the same message. "That's real professional. It's real life," Brendan said. Simple, flat, not defensive. Emma looked up at Troy with the frank curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that some things are better left unexamined. "You're very big," she told him. Troy blinked. Whatever he'd been about to say next dissolved somewhere in his throat. Thanks, kid. My dad's going to get this job," she said, and went back to her rabbit. The other men shifted. One of them, a red-faced guy with a crew cut and eyes too close together, muttered something to the man beside him. The man beside him stifled a laugh. Brendan heard it. He always heard it. He'd learned to let it sharpen him instead of bleed him. The coordinator, a wiry man in his 40s named Frank Greer, stepped out of a side office and looked at the assembled group with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found most of it unremarkable. He ran down the logistics with minimal ceremony. 12 candidates, 4 slots, 2 evaluation rounds. The first, physical conditioning. The second, situational response and threat assessment. A panel of 3 senior Ashford agents would observe throughout. The client, a name no one in that room was authorized to know yet, needed protection starting in 3 weeks. "Any questions?" Frank asked. No one had questions. Questions were also a kind of weakness, apparently. Frank's eyes landed on Emma, then on Brendan. The expression on his face said several things at once, none of them words. "Sir," Frank said carefully, "this is a closed evaluation." "I understand that," Brendan said. "She'll stay quiet. She has her rabbit." Emma held up the rabbit as if to confirm. Frank looked at her. He looked at Brendan. Something in the calculation shifted. "She can sit in the observation room," he said finally. "There's a chair." "Thank you," Brendan said. He walked Emma to the observation room himself, crouching down to her level in the hallway outside. She had her rabbit held against her chest and her eyes were fully awake now, tracking his face with the careful attention she'd had since she was very small, the way she always watched him when she sensed something was at stake. "I need you to stay in here, okay?" he said. "I'll be right outside. Are you going to win?" He almost smiled. "I'm going to try. You always try," she said, "and you always figure it out." He held her face between both hands for a moment, pressed a kiss to her forehead. Then he stood up, rolled his shoulders once, and walked back out into the room where the men were already beginning to stretch and pace. burning off energy the way animals do before something starts. What none of them knew, what the coordinator didn't know, what the smirking men with their crossed arms and sidelong glances didn't know, was where Brendan Kowalski had been for the better part of the last 14 years. He hadn't been mowing lawns. He hadn't been walking dogs. For 11 years, he'd worked close protection and threat assessment for a private security firm operating primarily in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. He'd done contract work in environments where the margin between a good day and a catastrophic one was measured in attention and reflex, and the ability to make decisions at a speed that bypassed conscious thought. He'd done it quietly, without ceremony, without the kind of resume that fit neatly into a box on an intake form. Then his wife had gotten sick, then she had died. And then there was Emma, 4 years old, standing in a hospital corridor, holding a stuffed rabbit, and Brendan had looked at her and understood with the absolute clarity of grief that some things reorder everything else. He'd come home. He'd found work that kept him stateside: private event security, corporate logistics, transport protection, smaller work, quieter work. Work that let him be home by dinner most nights, that let him read to her before bed, that let him be the one who knew which nights she had bad dreams and needed the light left on in the hallway. The bodyguard position at Ashford had come through a contact, someone who'd worked alongside him years ago and remembered what he was capable of. The salary would change things. Not everything, but enough. Enough that Emma could stay in her school. Enough that the car wouldn't need a third resole. Enough that he could stop doing the math at the grocery store in a way that he hoped she never noticed but was fairly sure she did. He hadn't told anyone his history. The intake form had asked for current employment, and he'd listed the most recent firm. No one had dug further. No one looking at him that morning had thought to dig further. The physical evaluation began at 7:30. The conditioning portion was structured and timed: pull-ups, loaded carries, timed sprints, balance and stability under resistance. The kind of thing that looks simple and isn't. Brendan moved through it without drama. He didn't push for display. He hit the numbers he needed to hit, rested where rest was available, and conserved what he knew he might need later. Troy Madden finished the conditioning portion with the satisfied air of a man who had never doubted how this would go. He'd blown through the pull-ups, carried the weighted sled like it was furniture, run the sprint in a time that made Frank Greer actually write something down in his notebook. He caught Brendan's eye on the way back from the final run and gave him a look that contained the entire conclusion he'd already reached before breakfast. The scores were tallied. 4 of the 12 were cut. Brendan was not among them. Troy didn't miss the fact that Brendan had made it through, but the look he gave him said that surviving the first round and deserving to be there were two different things. There was a break before the situational evaluations began. Brendan slipped into the observation room. Emma was sitting cross-legged in the chair, the rabbit in her lap, eating the crackers he'd packed for her with the methodical focus of a child who takes snacks seriously. "How's it going?" she asked. "Still in it? Good." She held out a cracker. He took it. "You comfortable?" "The chair is weird," she said, "but I'm okay." He sat with her for 3 minutes. Just sat. Not talking about the tryout, not running through anything in his head, just present with her, in that small room, watching her eat her crackers in the grayish morning light. It was the most grounded he'd felt since he'd walked in. Then he stood, touched the top of her head once, and went back out. The situational evaluations were run in pairs, which meant the observation room filled with the candidates not currently active. The scenarios were designed to test decision-making under pressure: mock threat assessments, close protection positioning, verbal de-escalation. The kind of work that separated men who could lift things from men who could think while lifting things. Brendan was paired for one scenario with a candidate named Derek Frost. Athletic, composed, clearly trained. They ran the scenario cleanly. The evaluators made notes. Nothing dramatic, just competent work done efficiently. Troy, in his scenario, was dominant and quick. He moved well for his size, which was genuinely impressive. He'd clearly done this before, or something close to it. The men watching from the observation room murmured among themselves in the way that people do when they recognize what they're looking at. After the pairings concluded, Frank Greer stepped forward. "One final component," he said. "Direct assessment. Evaluators will select 2 candidates for a controlled engagement. Observation only, no contact." He paused. "Ashford uses this to assess real-time threat response and physical capability under direct stress." He looked at his clipboard. Then he looked up. Kowalski. Madden. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something becomes more interesting than people expected. Troy looked at Brendan with something that had moved past smirking into something more serious, more considered. The kind of look that says, "Okay, now I'll actually pay attention." They set up in the center of the room. The three evaluators took positions along the wall. Frank explained the parameters: a controlled assessment of defensive response and positioning, no full contact, structured observation. The goal was not to fight. The goal was to demonstrate capability. And yet, there is something that happens in a room when two men stand across from each other with the explicit acknowledgement that one of them could, if the parameters shifted, do something to the other. The air changes. It becomes more honest. Troy moved first. He was fast for his size, surprisingly fast, and he came in with the confidence of a man who expected his speed and mass to settle things quickly. It was the right instinct for the wrong opponent. Brendan didn't retreat. He angled. A small, precise shift in his footing that changed the geometry of the engagement entirely, that redirected the force of Troy's momentum without absorbing it. What followed was brief. Not a fight, because Frank had said no contact, but a demonstration, a sequence of repositions and redirections that, had the parameters been different, would have left Troy with very few good options. The evaluators watched. One of them said nothing, but uncapped a pen and began writing. Troy stepped back. He looked at Brendan, really looked at him in a way that hadn't happened earlier that morning. Something in his expression had rearranged itself. "Where'd you train?" he said, not hostile, genuinely asking. "Several places," Brendan said. Frank Greer cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, which in evaluator language meant, "That's enough of that." The candidates were told to wait. The three evaluators conferred in the side office. Through the glass, the men waiting could see the movement of bodies, the scratching of pens, the occasional gesture toward the list of names on the wall. Brendan went back to the observation room. Emma was asleep in the chair, her head tilted sideways, the rabbit still tucked under her arm. He sat beside her and didn't move. He let the quiet settle over both of them. Outside, the city was fully awake now, filling the windows with gray light and motion. He thought about the 14 years. The places he'd been, the things he'd kept himself from thinking about during those years because thinking had been a luxury the work didn't allow. He thought about coming home and what it had cost him and what it had given him. He thought about Emma's face in the hospital corridor, the way she'd held that rabbit. He wasn't afraid of not getting the job. He was afraid of getting back in the car and telling her he'd tried and it hadn't been enough, and watching her believe him when she said it was okay. He was afraid of how good she'd gotten at saying it was okay. Frank Greer appeared in the doorway. He looked at Brendan sitting beside his sleeping daughter in the observation room chair. He looked at the rabbit. His expression did something complicated that wasn't quite professionalism and wasn't quite sentiment but lived somewhere in between. "Mr. Kowalski," he said. Brendan looked up. "We'd like to speak with you." He glanced at Emma. She was deeply asleep, the way children sleep when they've been patient for too long and their body finally collects the debt. "She'll be okay for 10 minutes?" he asked. "We can bring a chair to the doorway," Frank said. "So you can see her from the office." They did. They brought a chair to the open doorway of the side office, angled so that Brendan, seated across from the three evaluators, had a clear sight line to his daughter through the glass. The lead evaluator was a woman in her early 50s named Patricia Vane. She had short gray hair and the kind of eyes that had seen a great deal and processed most of it without visible disturbance. She looked at Brendan's file, then at Brendan with equal steadiness. "Your intake form listed current employment as Meridian Transport Security," she said. "But there's a gap. 8 years prior to that you didn't address." "The form asked for current employment," Brendan said. "It did," she agreed. "I'm asking about the rest of it now," he told her. "Not everything. That would have taken far longer than 10 minutes, but enough. The firm, the work, the geography, the kinds of environments, the kinds of decisions." He spoke about it plainly, without theater, the way you speak about something that doesn't require elaboration because the facts are sufficient. Patricia Vane listened. She made no notes while he spoke, which meant she either wasn't going to use what he said or she was going to remember it anyway, suspected the latter. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Why did you leave?" she asked. "My daughter," he said. She nodded once. She looked down at his file. She looked up again. "The evaluation panel is recommending you for one of the 4 positions," she said. "I want to be direct with you about that." Brendan held very still. "The recommendation is based on your performance today," she continued, "and on what you've just told me, which we'll need to verify. But I want you to understand, the panel was watching before the formal assessments began. The way you brought her in, the way you talked to her, the way you went and sat with her during the break." She paused. "We protect people for a living. We notice how people treat the ones they're responsible for." He didn't have anything to say to that. He wasn't sure he was supposed to. "You'll hear from us formally within 48 hours, Patricia said, "pending verification." He stood. He shook her hand and the hands of the two evaluators beside her and walked to the observation room. Emma was still asleep. He crouched beside the chair and watched her for a moment. The rise and fall of her breathing, the rabbit still clutched in the crook of her arm, her face slack and trusting and entirely at peace in the way that only children can be when they are being watched over by someone they love without question. He thought about what Patricia Vane had said. The way you talked to her, the way you went and sat with her during the break. He hadn't thought of those as things to be evaluated. He'd just been her father. He reached over and adjusted the rabbit so it didn't fall. He smoothed her hair back once, gently. Then he sat beside her and waited, the city spreading out behind the glass, patient and enormous and indifferent, while his daughter slept and the morning finished becoming itself. When Emma woke up 20 minutes later, she looked at him with the slow, assembling focus of someone returning from far away. "Did you get it?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "Maybe." She considered this. "What does maybe mean?" "It means they liked what they saw." She yawned, pulled the rabbit tighter. "I told you," she said simply. "I told you you'd figure it out." In the main room, the other candidates were filtering out. Most of them didn't look at Brendan as they passed. Troy Madden did. He stopped in the doorway of the observation room for a moment, looking at the two of them, the man and the little girl and the rabbit, and something in his expression had gone quiet, the smirk entirely gone, replaced by something that might have been recognition. "Good luck," Troy said, and he seemed to mean it. "You too," Brendan said. Troy nodded once and walked to the elevator. The call came 37 hours later on a Tuesday evening while Brendan was making dinner. Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework, or something adjacent to homework that involved a great deal of drawing in the margins of her worksheet. His phone buzzed on the counter beside the stove. He looked at the number, set down the spoon, answered. It was Patricia Vane's assistant. Formal, efficient reading from something prepared. Verification complete, panel recommendation confirmed, offer letter to follow by email within the hour. Start date 3 weeks from Monday. He said thank you. He said he looked forward to it. He ended the call and stood at the stove for a moment with the phone still in his hand. Emma looked up from her worksheet. She'd been watching him the whole time. That careful, particular attention. "Was that them?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, and he looked at her. 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a rabbit on the chair beside her and marker on her hands from the drawing in her margins, watching him with the absolute uncomplicated faith of someone who had never had a reason to doubt him even when the reasons were plentiful. "We got it," he said. She threw her pencil in the air. It hit the light fixture and bounced off the table and landed somewhere under the refrigerator, and neither of them cared at all. She was across the kitchen in 4 steps, her arms around his waist, her face pressed into his side, and he held her there for a long moment with his chin on the top of her head, the dinner still cooking on the stove, the email on its way through some server somewhere in the city, making its way to him. He thought about the room that morning, the men with their crossed arms and their calculated looks, the smirk, the laugh. The word professional delivered like a verdict. He thought about Emma's voice, clear and certain, in the middle of all of it. "My dad's going to get this job." She'd said it to Troy Madden like it was simply a fact of the universe. Like it wasn't a question anyone needed to ask. And she'd been right. Not because she'd willed it into being. She was 7, and the universe didn't generally operate on the confidence of 7-year-olds, however complete that confidence might be. She'd been right because she knew him. Because she'd been there through everything that had made him who he was, even the parts she was too young to understand, and on some level that lived below language and explanation, she understood them anyway. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. She didn't let go. The kitchen smelled like garlic and butter. The email arrived with a soft chime on his phone. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in the early evening in October, going gray and cold and indifferent in the beautiful way of large cities that owe you nothing and give you everything anyway. "Can we celebrate?" Emma asked, muffled into his shirt. "What do you want?" She pulled back and looked up at him. She had marker on her cheek, he noticed, in addition to her hands. He didn't say anything about it. "Ice cream," she said. "And I want to pick the flavor. You always pick the flavor." "Because your flavor is boring," he laughed. It came from somewhere low and loose, from a place that had been held tight for a long time and was only now beginning to understand it didn't have to be. "Okay," he said. "You pick." She grabbed her rabbit from the chair. She went to get her shoes. He turned off the stove, tucked his phone into his pocket, and followed her to the door. This man who had worked in places the forms didn't ask about and come home to something the forms couldn't measure. This man who had walked into a room full of people who had already decided what he was, and who had stood there in his worn boots and his frayed Henley and let them be wrong, quietly, thoroughly, and without asking anyone for permission. His daughter was already at the door, one shoe on and one shoe off, rabbit under her arm, looking back at him with that face. Impatient, radiant, entirely sure of him. He grabbed his keys. He followed her out.